At 58, Eleanor had already lost a husband of 30 years, a home she had polished and perfected until it shone with a life that was no longer hers, and the comfortable, settled quiet she had mistaken for a future. All Richard, the man who had carefully and methodically erased her from his own story, left her with was a set of keys to a place the world called worthless, a roadside motel bought out of probate for the almost insulting sum of $1, and the echo of his pitying laughter. The deed was a joke, a final, dismissive flick of the wrist. But what nobody knew, what even Eleanor had only felt as a half-remembered hum deep in her bones, was that her father had never built a single thing that was meant to be broken. He had a saying, one he'd repeat while planing a piece of wood until it was smooth as river stone, his knuckles scarred from a lifetime of quiet labor. Some doors, he'd say, only open for the right key. That, though, comes later. First, there was the ending of things. It happened on a Tuesday in October, the air outside crisp with the coming cold, the maple tree in their manicured front yard letting go of its fiery leaves in silent, drifting surrender. The divorce papers were not served by a stranger, but placed, neatly squared, on the granite island in the kitchen she had designed. They sat beside a bowl of lemons, a stark white rectangle against the cheerful yellow. Richard had already packed a bag. He stood by the door, wearing a suit she had picked out, his face a mask of polite, impenetrable resolve. He spoke of diverging paths, of needing something different, of a life he wanted to live that no longer included her. The words were smooth, practiced, delivered with the same cool efficiency he used to close a real estate deal. There was no room for argument, no space for the ragged, tearing sound of a heart breaking. He was already gone, a ghost in his own house, leaving behind only the scent of his expensive cologne and the legal document that would dismantle her world. The weeks that followed were a blur of lawyers and lists, of dividing objects that had once formed the grammar of their shared life. He was generous, everyone said so. He let her keep the car. He offered a sum of money that sounded large but felt small, a severance package for 3 decades of service. He kept the house, of course. It was his name on the original loan, his vision that had driven its expansion from a modest bungalow to a sprawling, glass-walled monument to his success. Eleanor had been the one to choose the paint, to plant the gardens, to fill the rooms with warmth and light and the smell of baking bread. But that was a currency the law did not recognize. Her contribution was measured in ghost hours, in invisible labor, and it amounted to nothing on a legal ledger. She moved through the process in a fog of quiet compliance, making herself small, just as she had always done. She did not raise her voice. She did not weep in front of the smooth-faced attorneys. She packed her mother's china into boxes, wrapped the silver her grandmother had carried across an ocean, and felt each object grow heavy with the weight of a past that had no future. The final meeting took place in a conference room that smelled of leather and recycled air. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the sterile space. Richard was there, with his lawyer, and across the vast mahogany table, Eleanor sat with hers, a woman who seemed more tired than sympathetic. They went through the final checklist of assets. And then Richard, with a small, almost imperceptible smile, slid a folded, brittle document across the table. It was the deed to the Starlight Motel, her father's place. It had sat vacant for a decade, a collapsing relic on a strip of highway that had been bypassed by the new interstate years ago. The county had all but condemned it. "I picked it up for back taxes," he said, his voice smooth as polished stone. $1. Consider it a gift, a place to land." His lawyer shifted, uncomfortable. Eleanor's lawyer looked at her, a question in her eyes. It was an insult wrapped in the guise of charity, a final demonstration of his power and her powerlessness. He was giving her a ruin. He was giving her a grave. She looked at the deed, at the faint, spidery signature of her father at the bottom of a long-forgotten transfer form. She remembered the smell of sawdust and coffee that always clung to him, the feel of his calloused hand holding hers. He had lost the motel in the end, a quiet failure that had shadowed the last years of his life. Or so she had been told, so she had believed. Something shifted inside her then, a tiny, hard kernel of defiance in the soft landscape of her grief. She thought of his words. Some doors only open for the right key. She pushed the check for the settlement back across the table. No, she said. The word was quiet, but it landed in the silent room with the force of a slammed door. I'll take the motel. Richard's eyebrows went up. He laughed. It was not a kind sound. It was the sound of a man who had already won, who was watching his opponent make a final, foolish move. Eleanor, be serious. The land is worthless. The buildings are rotten. It's a liability, not an asset. But she just looked at him, her gaze steady for the first time in months. She picked up the deed and the single, heavy brass key that lay beside it. The key was warm, as if it held the last of her father's heat. I'll take the motel, she repeated. And in that moment, she was no longer his wife, no longer a victim in his tidy narrative of success. She was her father's daughter, and she was going home. The drive out of the city was a slow exhale, a deliberate unspooling of the life she was leaving behind. She passed the gleaming office towers, the manicured suburbs with their identical green lawns, the sprawling shopping centers that promised a happiness you could purchase. It was Richard's world, a world built of surfaces, of transactions, of things that could be bought and sold and leveraged. She had lived in that world for 30 years, a quiet, decorative accessory, and she had not realized until now how it had starved the air from her lungs. The farther she drove, the more the landscape changed. The 4-lane highway gave way to a 2-lane blacktop, cracked and patched, that wound through rolling hills and farmland. The sky opened up, vast and blue. She passed rusted tractors sitting in fallow fields, mailboxes shaped like barns, and small towns with a single blinking traffic light. This was her father's world, a world of things that were made and fixed and tended to. A world of patience and quiet necessity. She remembered coming out here as a girl, sitting on a stool in his workshop behind the motel office. He was a man of few words, her father. He communicated through the careful, deliberate movements of his hands. He could fix anything, it seemed. A broken toaster, a sputtering car engine, the cheap plastic doll of a guest's child. He would turn the object over and over, his brow furrowed in concentration, and then, with a quiet click or a gentle twist, he would make it whole again. People saw him as a simple man, a failed businessman whose little motel was slowly being choked out by the big chains that were popping up by the new interstate. He was gruff, sometimes. Impatient with foolishness. He never had much money, and their life had been a constant, low-grade struggle against entropy, against the slow decay of things. Rust, leaks, unpaid bills. He fought it all with a quiet, stubborn persistence. The turnoff for the motel came up suddenly. The sign, once a cheerful beacon of painted stars and glowing neon, was now a skeleton of rusted metal and broken glass, hanging from a single bolt, creaking in the wind. The Sarlaito. She pulled her car onto the cracked asphalt of the parking lot, a graveyard of weeds and shattered pavement. The motel itself was a long, low building, a string of forgotten promises. The paint was peeling in long, sun-bleached strips, revealing the gray, weathered wood beneath. The windows of the guest rooms were dark and vacant, like the eyes of a skull. A few were boarded up. One was shattered, a spiderweb of cracks radiating from a single point of impact. It was worse than she had imagined. It was a ruin. Richard was right. This was a place where things came to die. She got out of the car, the silence broken only by the whisper of the wind through the dry weeds and the groan of the dying sign. She walked toward the office, the single brass key clutched in her hand. The door was flanked by 2 large, empty concrete planters where her mother had once grown geraniums of an impossible, shocking red. The paint on the office door was blistered, the wood beneath swollen and warped. "This is a mistake," a voice in her head whispered. "A foolish, sentimental mistake. Go back." But there was nowhere to go back to. She stood before the door, the final door, the only one left to her. She took a breath, the air smelling of dust and damp earth and a faint, lingering scent of motor oil that was so deeply her father's, it made her ache. She put the key in the lock. She had expected it to stick, to fight her, to resist. But it slid in smoothly, silently, as if it had been oiled that morning. It turned with a satisfying, solid click, the sound of a well-made thing doing the work it was designed to do. The door swung inward on silent hinges, opening into a darkness that held the cool, still air of a place that had been waiting for a very long time. And in the dim light, she saw a shape rise from a dusty rag rug on the floor. A slow, stiff movement of old bones, a low thump of a tail against the floorboards, a pair of gentle, golden eyes blinking up at her. It was Rusty, her father's dog, a golden retriever mix with a muzzle gone completely gray, the loyal, patient witness to the slow collapse of this place. He had been waiting too. The office was a time capsule of abandonment. A thick coat of dust lay over everything, a soft gray shroud. The front desk was a cluttered landscape of old registration cards, a disconnected rotary phone, and a coffee mug with a faded picture of a smiling fish. A calendar on the wall was still turned to a page from 10 years ago, a decade frozen in time. The air was thick with the smell of decay, of damp plaster and mildewed paper. But underneath it all, there was something else. The faint, clean scent of pine and linseed oil, the ghost of her father's workshop. Rusty padded over to her, his nails clicking softly on the linoleum floor. He pushed his great, gray head into her hand, his tail giving a few more hopeful thumps. A neighbor had been leaving food and water for him, a quiet act of kindness in a world of neglect. Eleanor knelt down, burying her face in his thick, dusty fur. Here was a creature who had not left, who had not betrayed, who had simply stayed and kept his silent vigil. In that moment, surrounded by ruin, she was not entirely alone. A truck rumbled past on the highway, its headlights cutting a brief, sweeping path through the dim room, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air like tiny, frantic stars. She stood up, her hand resting on the dog's steady back, and looked around the room that was now hers. It was not a gift. It was a burden, a wreck, a testament to failure. And yet, the key had turned. The dog was here. And for the first time in a year, she felt the flicker of something that was not grief, not fear, not humiliation. It was the barest whisper of purpose. The work began the next morning. She woke on a lumpy cot in the back room, the only piece of furniture not completely consumed by mildew, to the sound of Rusty whining softly at the door. The sun was just rising, casting a pale, watery light through the grime-streaked windows. The chill in the air was deep, a bone cold that settled into her joints. She made a pot of instant coffee on a small hot plate she'd brought, sharing a piece of toast with the old dog, and then she faced the enormity of her task. She started with the office because it was the heart of the place, the one room that had to function if anything else was to have a chance. She opened the windows, letting in the crisp autumn air, and began to fight back against the decade of dust and neglect. She swept, she scrubbed, she hauled bag after bag of trash out to the rusted bin behind the building. Old newspapers, empty liquor bottles left by squatters, the brittle, desiccated bodies of mice. It was grim, physical work, the kind of labor her soft, manicured hands were not used to. By noon, her back ached and her fingers were raw. She was attacking a mountain with a teaspoon. Just as she was about to sink into despair, a battered pickup truck pulled into the parking lot, its engine rumbling with a familiar, comforting growl. A woman in her late 60s, with a cloud of white hair and eyes that had seen everything twice, got out carrying a wicker basket. It was Mavis, the owner of the diner a mile down the road, a place that had been there even longer than the motel. "Thought you might be hungry," Mavis said, her voice a gravelly mix of kindness and command. She didn't wait for an answer, just pushed past Eleanor into the office and set the basket on the newly scrubbed counter. Inside was a thermos of hot coffee, 2 thick sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, and a slice of apple pie. "Your father was a good man," Mavis said, looking around the room, her gaze missing nothing. "Stubborn as a mule stuck in mud, but a good man, better than most folks knew." Eleanor felt a lump form in her throat. "Most folks thought he was a failure." Mavis snorted, a sound like gravel turning over. "Most folks measure a life in dollars and cents. Your father used a different kind of ruler. He'd be glad you're here. He always said this place would wait for the right person." She looked at Eleanor, her eyes sharp. "Guess you're it." Mavis left as abruptly as she had arrived, leaving behind the scent of coffee and cinnamon and the quiet comfort of her words. Eleanor ate the sandwich, the best she had ever tasted, and felt a warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the coffee. She was not just a divorced woman in a ruin. She was her father's daughter. She was the right person. The days that followed took on a rhythm. Wake, work, sleep. She moved from the office to the first of the 12 guest rooms. Each one was a small archaeology of abandonment. A tattered paperback left on a nightstand, a child's forgotten plastic soldier, a lipstick-stained cigarette butt in an ashtray. She tore out moldy carpets, scrubbed grime from the bathroom tiles until her arms shook with fatigue, patched holes in the plaster. With each small act of restoration, she felt as if she were mending something inside herself. Rusty was her constant shadow, following her from room to room, lying just outside the door of whichever chamber of horrors she was tackling that day. But at night, and whenever she was in the office, he would return to one specific spot. He would lie on the threadbare rug in the back corner of the office, his nose pointed toward a section of the wall beside the door to the workshop. He would lie there for hours, patient and watchful, as if waiting for someone to emerge. At first, Eleanor paid it no mind. It was just an old dog's habit, a comfortable spot. But after a week of watching him, she began to notice the wall itself. The office was built of plaster and lath, the walls cracked and uneven. But this one section, about 4 feet wide, was different. It was paneled in cheap, knotty pine, the kind of thing you'd see in a basement in the 70s. It didn't match anything else in the building. It looked like a later addition, a clumsy patch job. Her father had been a meticulous craftsman. His joints were seamless, his cuts precise. This wall was an anomaly. The seams between the pine boards were slightly uneven, the varnish applied in a hurry. It was the one piece of shoddy work in a place that, beneath all the grime and decay, had been built with care. One evening, exhausted, she sat at the desk, looking at the dog, looking at the wall. "Why there, Rusty? What are you waiting for?" She ran her hand over the pine boards. They felt smooth, but there was a strange lack of wear. No scuffs from chairs, no faded spots where a picture might have hung. It was as if this section of wall had been protected, untouched. She tapped it with her knuckles. The rest of the office walls returned a dull, solid thud. But when she tapped the pine paneling, one spot, low to the ground, gave back a different sound. A hollow, resonant echo. It was a small thing, a tiny deviation in the music of the room. But in the deep quiet of the failing light, it sounded as loud as a drumbeat. She had spent her life learning to ignore the things that felt wrong. The small dissonances in her marriage, the hollow places in her own heart. She had papered over them with politeness and routine, but she was not that person anymore. She would not ignore this. She knelt down, her knees protesting, and pressed her ear against the wood, the way her father had taught her to listen for the hum of a failing engine. She tapped again, gently. Thud, thud, boom. There it was, a space behind the wall. Her heart began to beat a little faster. It was probably nothing. A space for plumbing, a rodent's nest, an old repair. But her father had not done shoddy work. Unless the shoddiness was the point. Unless it was a disguise. a secret hidden in plain sight, concealed by its own apparent lack of craft. She thought of his words again, the phrase Mavis had echoed. This place will wait for the right person. She looked at the old dog, whose tail gave a slow, knowing thump against the floor. He had been waiting. And he had been trying to show her where. The search for a way in became a quiet obsession. For 2 days, she ran her hands over every inch of the pine paneling, pressing, tapping, searching for a latch or a hidden seam. She found nothing. The boards were nailed tight. There was no loose piece, no clever mechanical trick. Frustration began to build. Maybe she was imagining it. Maybe it was just an old wall and a dog's strange habit. On the 3rd night, she sat staring at it, a crowbar lying on the floor beside her. She could just tear it down, smash her way through. But that felt wrong, a violation. Her father was a man of puzzles and patience, not brute force. He would have built a door, not a wall to be broken. She remembered him in his workshop, surrounded by his tools, each one in its proper place. He had a rule for everything. Measure twice, cut once. Look at a problem from all sides before you pick up the hammer. She closed her eyes, trying to see the wall through his eyes. It was clumsy. Why? Because he wanted it to be overlooked. It was pine. Why? Because it was cheap and common. It was solid. Except where it wasn't. She thought about the way he built things, the logic of his craft. Everything had a reason. She stood up and went into the workshop, a place she hadn't dared to touch yet. It was even dustier than the office, but it was a space of order. Tools hung in neat silhouettes on a pegboard wall. Jars of screws and nails were sorted by size. On his workbench, under a canvas cloth, lay his last project, an unfinished wooden bird, its wings half-carved. Beside it was his favorite block plane, its blade still keen. She picked it up. The wooden handle was smooth, worn into the exact shape of his hand. And then she saw it. Tucked into a leather pocket on the side of the workbench was a small, thin piece of metal, like a palette knife, but with a strangely shaped tip. It wasn't a standard tool. It was something he had made. She went back into the office, the tool in her hand. She knelt before the wall again, her gaze scanning the seams between the boards. Measure twice. She looked at the baseboard. It ran the length of the wall, a single, uninterrupted piece of wood. But in one corner, almost hidden in the shadows, was a hairline crack that was not a product of age. It was a cut. A perfect 90-degree cut. She slid the thin metal tool into the nearly invisible seam. It fit perfectly. She pushed, gently. There was a soft, satisfying click. And a single board, no wider than her hand, popped open an inch, revealing a dark space behind it. It wasn't a door. It was a keyhole. A keyhole for a tool only he would have. Her breath caught in her chest. She pulled the board away. Inside the wall, in a small, neatly framed compartment, sat 2 objects. One was a thick, leather-bound ledger, the kind accountants used to use. The other was a small, cast-iron key, heavy and ornate. There was no treasure, no hidden cash, no gold. Just a book and a key. Rusty, who had been watching her with rapt attention, let out a soft whine and laid his head on her lap. She reached in and lifted out the ledger. It was heavy, solid, filled with the weight of years. She opened it to the first page. The handwriting was her father's, a neat, slightly slanted script. The entry was dated 40 years ago. It read, June 12th, family from Ohio, Ford Fairlane, broken fan belt, 3 children. Gave them room for. Fixed the belt in the morning. They had no money. The woman cried. She gave me a jar of peach preserves. Paid in full. She turned the page. And another. And another. Each page was the same. A date. A brief, unadorned description of a person in trouble. A family fleeing a bad situation. A young man whose car had died on the way to a job interview. A runaway teenager, scared and hungry. For each, there was a record of the help given. A free room, a hot meal from Mavis's diner, paid for by her father. A repaired engine, a tank of gas. a bus ticket home. There were hundreds of entries spanning decades. At the bottom of each, in the column where the payment should have been recorded, he had written the same two words: paid in full. This was not the record of a failed business. This was the secret history of a quiet, stubborn, and deeply compassionate man. The motel had never been about making money. It had been a sanctuary, a rescue station disguised as a business. He wasn't a failure. He was a secret saint, and this wall, this hollow place, was his tabernacle. She closed the book, her hands trembling, and held it to her chest. The tears she had not shed for her lost house, for her lost marriage, for her own shattered life, finally came. She wept for the father she had never truly known, for the breathtaking scale of his hidden goodness, for the beautiful, secret thing he had built and protected. And she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her soul, that she had not inherited a ruin. She had been given a trust. If you have stayed with this story this far, stay a little longer, because what happens next is the part I have been waiting to tell you. It is the part where a legacy, hidden in the walls of a forgotten place, begins to push its way out into the light. The discovery of the ledgers changed everything. The work of cleaning and repairing the motel was no longer a chore, it became an act of reverence. Each scrubbed floor, each patched wall, was a way of honoring the quiet work her father had done within them. She spent her evenings by the light of a single lamp, poring over the ledgers, the two thick volumes that chronicled a lifetime of uncredited kindness. The stories were stark, told in her father's plain-spoken prose, but they painted a vivid picture. He had sheltered women fleeing violent husbands, given broke musicians a place to practice, fed and clothed families who had lost everything in a fire. He had been a one-man safety net for anyone the world had broken and left on the side of the road. It was a staggering, secret generosity. She began to understand the gruffness, the impatience with small talk. He wasn't antisocial, he was busy. He was listening for the sound of a sputtering engine, watching for the slump of defeated shoulders in a driver pulling into his lot. He was conserving his energy for what truly mattered. About a month after she arrived, just as the last of the autumn leaves were clinging to the trees, a sleek, black SUV pulled into the lot, its polished chrome an affront to the motel's humble decay. Richard stepped out, looking as out of place as a diamond on a dusty work glove. He was with a younger man, his son from his first marriage, Mark, who looked deeply uncomfortable. Richard surveyed the scene. The new paint on the office door, the neatly swept walkway, the clean windows, with a look of bemused condescension. "Well, well," he said, his voice carrying the easy confidence of a man who always got his way. "Playing pioneer, are we, Eleanor? I have to admit, I'm impressed. You've made the old dump look slightly less condemned." She didn't rise to the bait. She stood on the porch of the office, a paintbrush in her hand, with Rusty sitting faithfully at her feet. "What do you want, Richard?" "I'm here to do you a favor," he said, pulling a sheaf of papers from a leather briefcase. "My company is acquiring a large parcel of land out here for a new commercial development, a distribution hub. This little plot of yours is right in the middle of it. It's useless to me as a motel, of course, but the land has value. I'm prepared to offer you $50,000 for it. Cash." $50,000. A year ago, it would have seemed like a fortune. It was enough to get a small apartment, to start over, to be comfortable. It was a lifeline. He was offering her an escape from this back-breaking work, from the cold nights and the aching muscles. Mark wouldn't meet her eyes. He was staring at the ground, his hands shoved in the pockets of his expensive coat. "The place isn't for sale," she said quietly. Richard laughed, that same dismissive sound she remembered from the lawyer's office. "Don't be sentimental, Eleanor. This place is a monument to your father's failure. Take the money. It's more than it's worth. It's a gift." "No," she said, her voice steady. "It's not for sale." His smile tightened. The mask of civility slipped, revealing the cold, transactional mind beneath. "I see. You think holding out will get you a better offer. It won't. This is my only offer. In fact, It's generous. I've had my people look at the county records. This place is riddled with code violations. The wiring is a fire hazard, the plumbing is shot, the septic system is non-compliant. I could have it condemned and torn down in a month, and you'd get nothing. It was a threat, delivered with a polite smile. He would crush her, not out of malice, but simply because she was in his way. An obstacle on a spreadsheet. "I'll take my chances," she said. He shook his head, a look of genuine pity on his face. "You always did choose the hard way. The offer stands for 48 hours. He turned and got back into his car, the door closing with a solid, expensive thud. Mark hesitated for a moment. "Eleanor," he started, then stopped, shaking his head. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Shame, perhaps, or regret, before following his father. The SUV pulled away, leaving a cloud of dust in its wake. The silence it left behind felt heavier than before. The threat lingered in the air. He was right, of course. The motel was a death trap by modern standards. She had no money for electricians, for plumbers, for a new septic system. She had nothing but her own 2 hands and a story nobody knew. That night, she couldn't sleep. Richard's words echoed in her head, a monument to failure. She looked at the ledgers sitting on the desk, their pages filled with a different kind of accounting. What was that worth in a world run by men like Richard? She remembered the other object she had found in the wall. The small, cast-iron key. She hadn't known what it was for. Now a thought occurred to her. She went to her father's old desk, the one she'd spent days cleaning and polishing. It was a solid oak piece he had built himself. It had 3 drawers on the right and a wide, shallow drawer in the center. All of them opened easily. But on the left, there was only a solid panel of wood. No drawer, no handle. Another anomaly. She ran her hands along the underside of the desktop. Her fingers brushed against a tiny, recessed hole, no bigger than the tip of her finger. The keyhole. Her hand was shaking as she retrieved the iron key. It was cold and heavy. She slid it into the hidden lock. It turned with a groan of disuse, and a section of the wooden paneling clicked open. It was a secret drawer, perfectly fitted, its existence completely invisible. Inside, resting on a piece of faded velvet, was a single, sealed envelope. On the front, in her father's familiar script, was one word: Eleanor. It was a letter from the dead. She sat for a long time, just looking at it, her heart pounding against her ribs. To open it felt like a final, irreversible step. It was the last message she would ever receive from him. Finally, she picked it up. The paper was thick and creamy. She broke the seal. The letter was short, just a single page. The words written with the same care he put into everything he made. "My dear Ellie," it began. "If you are reading this, it means you found my real books. It means you saw the wall for what it was, and you chose this place over the price someone else put on it. I knew you would. You have my heart and my stubbornness. I am sorry for the state I left things in. I ran out of time. This motel was never about money. I tried that for a while, but it felt like I was charging people for breathing. So I made it into something else. A safe harbor. A place for people to catch their breath when the world was chasing them. The books are the real accounting, the only one that ever mattered to me. The world will tell you this place is worthless. Men who only see lumber and land will try to take it from you. Do not let them. This motel is not a building. It is a promise. It is a responsibility. I am leaving it to you, not as a burden, but as a purpose. You know what to do. Your mother always said you knew how to make a place a home. Well, this is a home for the homeless. A light for those in the dark. Keep it lit. All my love, Dad. At the bottom, he had added a postscript. P.S. Measure twice, cut once. It works for most things in life. She read the letter 3 times, the words blurring through her tears. He had seen her. He had known her, better than her own husband had, better than she had known herself. He hadn't left her a wreck. He had left her his life's work. He had left her a mission. The fear that had been gnawing at her since Richard's visit was replaced by a calm, cold resolve. This was not just her fight anymore, it was his. The next morning, a certified letter arrived. It was an official notice from the county planning department. Multiple code violations had been cited following an anonymous complaint. A hearing was scheduled in 30 days. If the violations were not rectified by then, the property would be subject to a demolition order. 30 days. It was an impossible deadline. Richard was not waiting. He was moving to crush her. For a day, she allowed herself to feel the crushing weight of it. She wandered through the empty rooms, the scale of the necessary repairs mocking her. The wiring was frayed and ancient. The pipes leaked in 3 of the rooms. The septic field was a swampy mess. It would take tens of thousands of dollars, money she did not have, and an army of skilled laborers to bring the place up to code. It was hopeless. She sat on the porch as the sun went down, the demolition notice clutched in her hand, and watched the cars stream past on the highway, their occupants cocooned in their own lives, oblivious to her small, desperate battle. She was alone. But then she looked down at Rusty, who rested his head on her knee, his old eyes full of unwavering trust. And she thought of the letter, of the ledgers, of the hundreds of names and stories they contained. She was not entirely alone. She was the custodian of their stories. She spent the next week not with a hammer, but with the telephone. She sat at her father's desk with the ledgers open and began to make calls. The phone numbers were decades old. Most were disconnected. Some were answered by strangers who had no idea what she was talking about. The trail was cold, the people scattered by time. Doubt began to creep in. What was she doing? Trying to summon an army of ghosts to fight a modern-day developer? It was foolish. But then, on the 5th day, a woman answered. Her name was Sarah. Eleanor read her the entry from the ledger. July 2nd, 1988. Sarah and her 2 small boys. Car broke down. Fleeing a bad situation in Chicago. Gave them room 7 for a week until her brother could wire money for a bus ticket. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When the woman spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. I remember, she whispered. Oh my God, I remember. Your father. He saved our lives. He gave us food. He played checkers with my oldest son. He never asked for a thing. I never forgot him. Eleanor told her about the demolition order, about the fight she was in. She didn't ask for anything, just told her the story. The hearing is on the 17th, she said, her voice small. I thought someone should know. She made more calls. She found a man named George, a trucker whose rig had jackknifed in an ice storm. Her father had given him a room and a hot meal and helped him call for a tow. She found a woman whose family had been given shelter after a house fire. Slowly, painstakingly, she began to connect the threads of her father's secret life. She wasn't asking for help. She was bearing witness. The day of the town council hearing was cold and gray, a low sky spitting a miserable drizzle. The meeting room was small and stuffy, smelling of damp wool and stale coffee. It was mostly empty, just a few local busybodies and the bored-looking council members. Richard was already there, sitting in the front row, looking sleek and confident in a tailored suit. He had his architect with him and a lawyer. They had charts and blueprints. They looked like the future. Eleanor sat in the back, alone. She wore a simple dress and a cardigan she had darned at the elbow. In her hands, she held a worn leather ledger. She looked like the past. Mark was there, too, standing by the back wall, his face pale and drawn. He gave her a brief, pained look, then turned away. The meeting began. Richard's lawyer presented the case for the demolition. He spoke of public safety, of blight, of the need for progress. He painted a picture of Eleanor as a sentimental eccentric, clinging to a dangerous ruin. Then Richard himself spoke. He unrolled his blueprints, showing the council the gleaming, modern distribution center he planned to build. He spoke of jobs, of tax revenue, of a new era of prosperity for the town. It was a powerful, seductive vision. When he was done, the council chairman, a man with a weary face, turned to Eleanor. "Ma'am," he said, not unkindly, "do you have anything to say in response?" Eleanor walked to the podium. Her hands were shaking, but her voice, when she spoke, was clear and steady. "My name is Eleanor Vance," she said. "The Starlight Motel belonged to my father. It's true that it has fallen into disrepair. It's true that it violates many of the county's codes." Richard smiled, a small, triumphant smirk. "But a building is more than just wires and pipes," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "A place is more than just the land it sits on. Sometimes a place is a memory. Sometimes it's a promise." She opened the ledger on the podium. "My father kept meticulous records," she said. "I'd like to read you one of them." She cleared her throat and read the first entry she had found, the one about the family with the broken fan belt and the jar of peach preserves. When she finished, there was a confused silence in the room. The council members looked at each other. Richard's lawyer stood up. "Objection! This is irrelevant sentimental nonsense." "Let her speak," the chairman said, his eyes on Eleanor. So she read another entry, and another. She read the story of the runaway teenager her father had fed and convinced to call his parents. She read about the stranded musician who wrote a song in room 9 and later became famous. She read about the family who lost their farm and stayed at the motel for a month, for free, until they could get back on their feet. Her voice was the only sound in the room, a quiet testament against the language of profit and loss. As she was reading an entry from 1995 about a young couple whose baby was sick with a fever, a woman in the back of the room let out a small sob. She stood up, her face streaked with tears. "That was us," she said, her voice trembling. "My husband and I. Our little girl, she had pneumonia. We were terrified. We had no money. Your father, he called the doctor for us. He paid for the medicine. He told us not to worry about the room. Then an old man, his back bent with age, slowly got to his feet. 'I'm George,' he said, his voice raspy. 'The trucker from the ice storm. Your dad sat with me all night, drinking coffee, making sure I was all right. Said a man shouldn't be alone when he's had a scare like that.' One by one, they stood. A handful of people at first, then more. People she hadn't managed to reach on the phone, who had heard about the hearing through word of mouth, through the town's quiet grapevine. A woman who had been given a room while fleeing an abusive boyfriend. A man whose father had been given a final, peaceful place to rest on a cross-country trip to see a son he hadn't spoken to in years. They were the ghosts from the ledger, made flesh. They were her father's secret legacy, standing in a small, stuffy room, their faces a mixture of grief and gratitude. The council was stunned into silence. The charts and blueprints on Richard's easel suddenly looked flimsy, soulless. He was not proposing to tear down a building. He was proposing to erase a history, to pave over a sanctuary. His face had gone from confident to irritated to a pale, mottled white. He was being undone, not by a lawyer, but by a book full of quiet stories. And then, the back door of the room opened. A young man walked in, his face set with a difficult resolve. It was Mark. He walked straight to the podium, past his father, who hissed his name. He stood next to Eleanor. "My name is Mark Peterson," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "Richard Peterson is my father, and everything Eleanor Vance has told you is true. But there's more." He took a deep breath. "My father knew about the motel's history. We found out about it during the title search. He told me it didn't matter. He said it was ancient history, that it had no monetary value. He told me to bury it. The room was utterly still. Richard looked as if he had been struck. He sent me to the motel to offer her money, and when she refused, he filed the anonymous complaint himself, using a shell corporation. He manufactured this crisis to force her out. He turned and looked, not at the council, but at Eleanor. I am ashamed of what I've done, and what I've been a part of. I can't work for a man who would deliberately try to destroy something so good. As of this moment, I resign from my position at his company. He then turned back to the council. And I would like to make a formal pledge. I'm a certified contractor. I will personally oversee the repairs to the Starlight Motel, at no cost to Ms. Vance. I'll donate the materials, and I will do the labor myself. We will bring it up to code. Every last wire, every last pipe. We will honor what her father built. He stepped away from the podium and stood beside Eleanor, a silent, public declaration of his allegiance. The spell was broken. The chairman of the council cleared his throat. He looked at Richard, his face a mask of cold disappointment. Mr. Peterson, he said, his voice heavy with official finality, in light of this testimony, we are tabling the demolition order indefinitely. He banged his gavel. This hearing is adjourned. Richard sat frozen in his chair for a moment, his empire of blueprints and projections having crumbled into dust around him. The community he had sought to impress was now staring at him with open contempt. He gathered his papers, his movements stiff and jerky, and walked out of the room without a word, a man utterly diminished. The aftermath of the meeting was not loud or triumphant. It was quiet and profound. As Eleanor stood by the podium, the townspeople who had spoken, and many who had not, came up to her one by one. They didn't say much. A hand on her arm, a whispered, "Thank you," an offer to help. It was a current of quiet gratitude, flowing back to the source. Mark stayed by her side, humble and silent, accepting the wary looks from the older residents who still saw him as his father's son. He didn't make excuses. He just stood his ground, ready to begin his penance. The next morning, a Saturday, Eleanor woke to the sound of a truck pulling into the motel lot. It was Mark, his pickup loaded with lumber and tools. He didn't ask where to start. He just got out a pair of sawhorses and began the slow, methodical work of rebuilding a doorframe for room 1. He worked with a quiet, focused intensity, the rhythmic rasp of his handsaw a new kind of music for the old motel. By noon, he was not alone. George, the trucker, showed up with a commercial-grade pressure washer and began blasting the grime of decades from the motel's facade. Mavis arrived from the diner, not with a basket, but with a station wagon full of food. Pots of chili, loaves of fresh bread, a giant coffee urn. She set up a makeshift canteen on a picnic table and declared that no one would work hungry. Soon, others came. A retired electrician who had known her father offered to inspect the wiring. A plumber, whose son had been given a free room after a teenage fight with his parents, volunteered to tackle the leaking pipes. A group of women from the church arrived with buckets and paintbrushes. The community chorus had arrived to help. They descended on the Starlight Motel not as a charity case, but as a place that belonged to all of them, a piece of their collective history that they refused to let die. Eleanor moved among them in a daze of wonder, her heart so full it felt like it might break. She was no longer a lone woman fighting a losing battle. She was the conductor of an orchestra of kindness, the keeper of a place that was being reborn through the very same spirit in which it had been built. The work was slow and hard. There were setbacks. They discovered rot in the floorboards of 3 rooms, a hornet's nest in the attic, a well pump that was on its last legs. But for every problem, a solution appeared. For every moment of despair, a quiet act of generosity lifted them up. Mark was the first to arrive each day and the last to leave. He never spoke of his father. He just worked, his hands growing calloused, his expensive clothes replaced by dusty jeans and worn flannel shirts. He was earning his place, board by board, nail by nail. He and Eleanor developed a quiet, easy rhythm. They didn't talk much, but they understood each other. They were both rebuilding themselves alongside the motel. One afternoon, as they were replacing a window in room 5, he paused and looked at her. "He disowned me," Mark said, his voice flat. "My father. He called me, said I was no longer his son, that I had publicly humiliated him." Eleanor stopped what she was doing and met his gaze. "Family isn't just about blood, Mark," she said softly. "It's about who shows up." He gave her a small, grateful smile and went back to his work. The motel was transformed, not into a gleaming, modern facility, but into something clean and sturdy and welcoming. The peeling paint was gone, replaced by a fresh coat of pale yellow. The broken windows were fixed, the weeds were cleared, and in the concrete planters by the office door, Mavis had planted a riot of bright red geraniums. The sign was taken down, lovingly restored by a local metalworker, its neon tubing repaired, its stars repainted a brilliant white. On a crisp evening in late spring, nearly a year after she had first arrived, they held a small ceremony. The whole town, it seemed, turned out. They gathered in the parking lot as the sun went down, and with a quiet cheer, Eleanor flipped a switch in the office. For the first time in over a decade, the sign for the Starlight Motel blinked on, its warm, hopeful glow pushing back the darkness. It was not a grand reopening, it was a reclamation. The motel would not be run as a for-profit business. With the help of a pro bono lawyer from town, Eleanor had turned it into a non-profit trust, funded by small donations from the community, dedicated to providing the same kind of temporary, no-questions-asked shelter her father had offered. It was a promise, made solid and real again. A year to the day after the town council meeting, Eleanor was in the office, updating the new ledger. It was a book much like her father's, already filling with new stories. A young woman who had left an abusive partner and needed a place to stay while she got a bus ticket to her sister's. A family whose apartment had flooded, who stayed for 3 nights until their insurance kicked in. Mark had stayed on, living in one of the rooms, serving as the motel's full-time handyman and caretaker. He was quieter now, more thoughtful. He was finding a new way to measure his own life. As dusk settled, casting long shadows across the parking lot, a beat-up sedan with a flat tire limped off the highway and coasted to a stop near the office. A young man got out, his shoulders slumped in defeat. A woman in the passenger seat was holding a crying baby. They looked tired and scared and out of options. Eleanor watched them for a moment. She saw the echo of a dozen stories from her father's ledger. She saw the reason this place existed. She put down her pen, walked to the key rack behind the desk, and took down the key for room 4. She stepped out onto the porch, Rusty rising stiffly to follow her. The old dog's tail gave a gentle thump, thump, thump against the door frame. The young man looked up as she approached, his face a mask of anxiety. "I'm so sorry," he said, his voice cracking. "Our tire, we don't have a spare, and I don't get paid till Friday. We have nowhere to go." Eleanor smiled, a warm, genuine smile that reached her eyes. "Looks like you could use a place to stay for the night," she said, holding out the key. "The room's already warm. You can settle the baby in, and then we'll see about getting that tire fixed." The man stared at her, then at the key, his expression shifting from despair to disbelief, and then to a profound, overwhelming relief. "But we can't afford." "Don't you worry about that," Eleanor said softly. "Some things aren't measured in money." She placed the key in his hand. It was a simple brass key, just like the one that had let her into this new life. She watched as the small family went into the warm, clean room, the light spilling out into the growing darkness. She stood on the porch for a long time, the cool night air on her face, listening to the quiet hum of the world. On the check-in counter, just inside the office door, sat a small wooden bird, the one her father had left unfinished. She had sanded it smooth and placed it there as a reminder. Beside it lay the open ledger, waiting for a new story to be written. The starlight was lit. The promise was being kept. Some doors, she thought, only open for the right key. And some keys don't open doors. They open a life.
Wait, not for you. That's not for you. It's for me. Okay. See, it's just the purple. I knew exactly what you're talking about. Nice, Clara. Let's see. We'll put those in there. This is actually perfect though, because we did need lumber. No, feed him one. Okay, fine, Lucifer. There you go. Yeah, no problem, Lucifer. Okay, we'll throw these in there. Ooh, thanks for the water reminder, Emma. Okay. This is an amazing storage idea. Thanks, Ghost Hashira. Also, that's an awesome username. Love Demon Slayer. We need a gaming chair. Maybe I put plants up here. I think that'll look nice. We also actually need that TV. And 2 more of these. Okay. Let's swing by. Where do I want to go? Chair, table, light, and then wildflowers. You know, I can always just bring wildflower seeds. Maybe I'll just do that. Or apparently I have a bunch of my inventory. Never mind.